Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's Dan here from Collective Shout. We're kicking off 2022 with our series, Reimagining Masculinity, conversations with men challenging porn culture. And I'm absolutely delighted today to be speaking with Benji Nolot. For those of you that don't know Benji, I'm just going to do a little bit of a bio, and then as always, we will jump into it. But Benji is an American filmmaker and the CEO and founder of Exodus Cry, an international anti-trafficking organization that works in the areas of prevention, intervention, and restoration. He's been a featured speaker at the United Nations, and Benji has a passion for storytelling and was the director, producer, and writer of the award-winning documentary, Nefarious Merchant of Souls, a hard-hitting documentary film about human trafficking. One of his other films that you may be aware of is Liberated, the New Sexual Revolution, which we promoted late last year because one of the former guests, Shay Douglas, featured in it. And that film documents spring breakers in Florida and confronts the viewer with the exploitation of female bodies and the porn industry's impact on millennial hookup culture. And at the end of last year, his team launched Raised on Porn, which exposes the way pornography has become the new sex education for children and unpacks the dangerous lifelong implications of this global phenomenon. Benji, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you so much for your work.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. I love the work that you guys are doing, and it's just such a great opportunity just to connect with you guys. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I look forward to hopefully coming over to the US at some point and meeting you guys all in the flesh, and obviously continuing to collaborate on these issues, in particular, you know, with what you guys started in terms of a global conversation with Raised on Porn. I think that's a fantastic documentary, which for everyone listening in, we just commend to you. We'll put the links on our socials and in our stories for everyone to watch that. It's free and available on YouTube. But let's kick things off, Benji. I'd just love to hear, and for our audience to hear about your story of how you came to recognize the injustice of human trafficking and sexual exploitation.
Oh man, that's such a big question. Well, as it pertains to the subject of pornography, I'll just kind of tackle that one. So I first became aware of the issue of human trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation back in 2007. And I felt at the time like there was an opportunity to help tell the story, to get awareness out there, to let people know what's going on. But the decision to do that led me on a 4-year journey across 4 continents, 19 countries, and 42 cities, documenting the global phenomenon of sex trafficking. And during that time, I began to see the overlap with pornography. And in red light districts where we were going, pornography would be used to market the women who were in prostitution. And then we began to see, you know, in talking to the men, how all of these men that we talked to that were out buying women for sex had a history of pornography consumption. And so it was the fuel, it was the marketing, and then we started to look at the porn industry and discovered that there was a coercive element as the backdrop of a lot of the pornography that was being created. And so we in 2012 pivoted to focus more heavily on that specific issue of pornography, and spent 8 years going and researching everything ever written on pornography, going undercover into the porn industry to make a docu-series about what was going on in pornography. And in 2020 is when we felt like we finally needed to begin to disclose some of our findings. And what has happened over the last 1.5 years to me is just a remarkable sign that our world is mobilizing to address this exploitation and to stop, you know, hiding our head in the sand. And so I'm really encouraged to see kind of the movement that's taking shape. Collective Shout has been a huge ally for us in this. And yeah, we're grateful to see what's happening.
Yeah, I agree. I'm very much encouraged by what's happening globally. I mean, just seeing people that normally wouldn't be critical of pornography, even coming part way and recognizing that some porn is harmful. Obviously, we believe it's all harmful, it's all exploitative, but voices 5 years ago that used to think it was okay are now changing their tune. And I don't know how much credit to give you guys, but I know that you guys have been such a pivotal force in changing the cultural imagination and thinking about that. Can I ask if there was any particular moments when you went from, okay, I'm aware of this problem, but we actually have to do something about that? If there was any experiences or things that you were confronted with that were just such a catalyst for you?
That's a good question. I think, for me, like when I first discovered this issue, I had no conception that I would start an organization to fight human trafficking. It was something that I was greatly burdened by, that I prayed about, and I tried to learn as much as I could about. And what that did for me is it kind of started to awaken an idea for what I might be able to contribute to help make a difference. And so when people ask me today, how do I get involved? There are some like lanes, that you can point people to, but really, I think everything starts with education. And people, when they educate themselves about this issue, I think will start to get a sense of like, this is where I might be able to make a difference. And I just think that's so different for everyone. And I know, just thinking of my own experience, but yeah, for me, it was realizing that, man, like everybody needs to know what's going on. And I would be in a room of 100 people, 1,000 people. I would ask, how many of you have heard of human trafficking? And only see a few hands go up. And so that was really the compelling factor for me, where I just said, I have to help get this story out there. And I didn't feel like it was enough to just go talk about it. I did a short video that went viral, got a lot of attention. So I'm like, let's go make a documentary. I thought I would do it in 6 weeks, and it ended up taking 4 years. But that documentary has then paved the way for everything we're doing now, which telling this story is a mosaic, and it's going to take a lifetime, to get all the layers and complexities out there, and ultimately to peel back the cover narrative of the commercial sex industry to let people see the deeper truth. We just think that work is really important. I feel, just really privileged to be in the space that I am to help be a part of this.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for it. I know for me, your work was a very much a solidifying catalyst to do something. And as you say, to identify what are the ways that I can do something about this, because I'm certainly not a documentary maker, but finding ways and people to partner with that have already got the wisdom and runs on the board to help people in this space. And I love what you say about storytelling. And obviously you're so passionate about impacting culture, because in my mind, and the language I use is I see pornography as propaganda. And there is so much of it that has distorted the ideas, the values, the beliefs of a whole generation of people about things like bodies, men, women, sex, love, intimacy. And I love what you have done in terms of, I guess, peeling back that and exposing the realities for what it is. And I think it is confronting for people, and it is shocking. And obviously your documentaries, that is their role. They don't touch it lightly. You can't look at that and then and not do something or not be challenged. I think, you have such a gift in that space. Can I ask for you to talk about culture and narrative? Like, what do you see as some of the main cultural ideas in terms of socialization? You've spoken to that previously, and in terms of like what's forming men and our ideas of masculinity in the West.
Sure. First, let me just say that, Daniel, I think you're a great communicator. And I think it's, you guys at Collective Shout have like a real gift for communication and for really dissecting, diagnosing, unpacking these somewhat complex issues around gender and sexuality and how they pertain to the commercial sex industry. And I've learned so much from you guys, and I just want to encourage you to, keep going with that. So thank you for having these conversations and for what you guys are doing, because it's really helping to shape the messaging of this whole movement. And yeah, just really enjoy learning from you guys. So with regards to the story in our culture about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a sexual being, those things, as you guys know, are really at the foundation of all of this. And so after we filmed Nefarious, I felt like I wanted to get deeper into the roots of what is underpinning this whole massive multi-billion-dollar industry. And so we started to look at what are the stories that our culture is telling about what it means to be a man, a woman, and a sexual being. And just to kind of like put it real simply, we found that, in all of our analysis, and we talked to sociologists and psychologists and media experts, and I mean, we spent a lot of time doing interviews and researching, and but really what we boiled down to is that we live in a pornographic culture.
Yep.
That is a culture that casts men as sexual predators, a culture that casts women as sexual objects, and a culture that casts sex as a meaningless recreational act as a vehicle for abuse and exploitation of another. And so really it was in identifying the messages behind the stories that were being told. And like you said, it's propaganda, it's messaging without truth. And so there's these stories that are being told. And then, for you or I, like growing up in this media age is such a unique kind of social experiment where we're being exposed to things that previous generations were not exposed to, like the mass media that's out there. And it's just natural that we would internalize those stories in the construction of our identity, our worldview, our values, the way that we see the world, women,
Yep.
our and all of these things. And so as we were looking into this film, we started to see the collision point between the stories that we tell about what it means to be a man, the stories that we tell about what it means to be a woman, and the stories that we tell about what it means to be a sexual being. And that collision point was a culture of sexual violation. And so really the thread, the backbone of Liberated is about men's entitlement to women's bodies. If you grow up internalizing these stories and seeing them in a subjectified way, then you become entitled to that object of like, to satiate some kind of need for masculine validation and sexual, satisfaction. And so, so we wanted to film at spring break because we felt like it was a sort of like a exaggerated environment to see all these ideals come out and the confluence of them together. And so, in the 5 years that we filmed at spring break, we did not meet a single young woman who had not been sexually violated during her time at spring break. I'm just going to say that again. In 5 years of filming at spring break, we did not meet one single young woman who had not been sexually violated during her time at spring break.
My goodness.
Sexual violation was universal. And when you see something at that level happening, this isn't an anomaly. These aren't a few aberrant cases of sexual violation. There is a normalization of sexual violation that is woven into the fabric of this culture of entitlement that has been incubated since childhood, subconsciously or unconsciously, by the stories that we're all surrounded with.
Yep.
And so if we want to solve the problem of sex trafficking, we have to look at the culture, and we have to look at the facilitating culture that is lubricating these factors and these ideas and creating this environment. Sex trafficking doesn't exist because there are a few evil guys out there with horns on their head, like, trafficking women. No, it exists because of this facilitating culture that we all live in. And
100%.
so,
yeah.
so the cultural piece is huge. the way that we grow up understanding what it means to be a man is huge. And also, I have a lot to say on the female side of that as well. But yeah, creating Liberating was a very illuminating experience to understanding the backdrop and the underlying factors of human trafficking.
Yeah, I thank you so much. That was just emphatic, and it confirms my experience, which I hope you don't mind me adding. Like one of the biggest tragedies is when I'm speaking to young people, the young women don't know that what's actually happened to them is sexual assault or sexual harassment. So they'll retell these stories and they'll explain to us this has happened. But because how normalized this is, and this porn culture, as we say, they don't even recognize the harm that is being done for them, because they think this is par for the course of being a young woman growing up in this culture. And even more tragic, and where we need to put our attention, is the young men who are either doing this willingly, knowing that they're violating a young woman for their own end. But then there's even so worrying is so many of them don't realize that what they're doing is not okay, because they have been so conditioned by this porn propaganda and by what the culture tells them, that women are available anywhere, anytime for sex, anyhow, and they're not going to really resist. And if they do, it's only a part of the game.
Yeah.
And so we have now created this horrific scenario, and we're having a bit of a reckoning in Australia around kind of consent and sexual assault. But obviously for Melinda and the team at Collective Shout, there's no surprises for them, because it's like, this is such an obvious outworking of culture. You don't need to be a prophet to have looked in the 70s and 80s to see where this was heading. And speaking of which, let's take it back as a little segue to how about December 1952 with the first Playboy magazine. What happened from that point on with Hugh Hefner and the first Playboy magazine? I'd love you to be able to speak to that, Benji.
Yeah, so, I think that there are three events that really changed the entire landscape of sexuality in our world. I think that the launch of Playboy magazine was the big bang, if you will, of this whole kind of redefining of sexuality. And so I thought a lot about this. Hugh Hefner, he was inspired by a guy named Alfred Kinsey, who wrote a book called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, which was released in 1948. And sexual behavior in the human male was, it sort of provided the underpinnings, if you will, and the research. Alfred Kinsey was a Darwinian researcher, and although he used fraudulent means in his research, he provided a body of research that somebody like Hefner could build on. And he said, if he was the researcher, I am his pamphleteer. So he launched Playboy magazine with the idea that this isn't just a bunch of nude images, that it's an ideology. It's a completely different way of understanding sex. And what that was the normalization of all kinds of deviant aspects of sexuality. And so when Playboy magazine came out, as Gail Dine says, he took Playboy from the back street to the main street. Pornography went from being something that was sort of like, stigmatized and looked down on, and something that became a part of the mainstream culture. And in that, he created a business model based on the objectification and hypersexualization of the female body. And that model then was patterned after. It influenced the music industry, it influenced the advertising industry, it influenced the movie industry. Everybody began to realize how profitable it was to objectify and hypersexualize women. Yep. And to, pose women in positions that were intended to capture the lustful male gaze. And so I think that, Hugh Hefner, I look at him as the father of porn culture. And so as that progressed and that evolved, I think that over time, people's ideas about what sex is and who women are and who men are began to evolve and change in very dramatic ways, which has brought us to where we're at today. So I think, yeah, going back, it's interesting to look at the history. It's interesting to look at the ideological, philosophical foundation and just the historical development of these things that have brought us from a place where, there were certain protections around sex and certain protections around relationships and society and the family unit and how you build that and how we do it together. And all of those things were disrupted and challenged and overthrown by a pornographic ideal. And some people would say, well, maybe that was needed and to challenge some of these traditional notions. But I think that, like Giacomo Belli said, that while the sexual revolution and all these developments may have made sex more permissive, it hasn't granted it the level of reverence that it should deserve. And so regardless of where somebody lands on their ethical view of human sexuality and just humanity in general, I think that, we should all be able to agree that this very intimate act of sexual intimacy, whatever sex, has value, that it means something, right? Because if it
has
didn't,
significance irrespective of someone's worldview. And I say this always in schools. I can say that not from any particular ideological frame, but because it is the only act that creates a future that unites two people together forever and ever in the birth of a child. Potentially, not obviously every sexual act, but it's the only thing that is capable of doing that. So it is significant in its capacity to do that. And the bonding as a result of that between two people.
And it's the only way for two people to wholly give themselves to each other.
I completely agree. And so,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I think that is the shift, and that was a big push from Kinsey, who's obviously completely co-opted, sexology, which is birthed from his idea, which is far more anchored sex in a physical experience and genital arousal and sexual arousal than a desire between two persons for one another, anchored in some sort of relationship and some sort of reciprocity within that relationship. So he completely unraveled and unpicked what sexual activity was about and divorced it from any notion of relationship, of marriage, of family, of the possibility of creating children, and just united it around this notion of purely arousal, and not even arousal with a person that you care about, but just any old arousal. And obviously then the biggest difficulty with that is obviously there's always been sexual perversions and these things have always existed. It's just that through Playboy and porn culture, these things, instead of being pushed back against in culture and having a frame of reference that these things aren't okay, porn culture has actually just tried to further and further normalize and legitimize this, all the way to the fact that we're now trying to push back against things that it's like, how did we get to the point where we're now trying to normalize pedophilia and normalize violence within sexual acts and normalize, horrific things under the banner of sexual liberation? And I'm sure Benji, you could speak to this. I think the sexual revolution has completely failed women, because in my book, it's actually just what it's done is it's granted sexual access to the most misogynistic and porn-obsessed men. It's actually validated their worldview that women are exactly like them and that they will be up for anything that their kind of depraved desires are after.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And just to say, to piggyback on your point and to complete my thought from earlier, it's this idea that, that sex has value and that it means something. And if that's your starting point, then I think that that quote sums it up so well from Giacomo Belli, that the sexual revolution didn't grant sex the reverence that it deserves. And when you live in a culture that's irreverent about sex, what you end up with is everything we're seeing, right? It's rape, it's rape, it's adultery, it's the most it's 3 dudes on 1 girl, it's the whole rampant, the pedophilia, it's everything that we see. So at a very, very, very core level, I feel like what we need to regain is a reverence for sex. That's not to say that it has to look this way or it has to look that way, but it's a basic core value that recognizes this powerful, potent act of sexuality should humble us.
Yeah.
It should treat it with reverence. It exposes our vulnerability as humans.
Yeah.
And if you just completely diminish its value, it'll take you for a ride. And the result is that we live in a corporately sexually traumatized planet. The result is that almost no one has a internal GPS guiding them into good decision-making around their sex. It's just, the whole thing is just completely been disintegrated. So we live in a sexually fractured world. And like Raquel Welch said, that pornography has annihilated a generation of men. And so I think, yeah, it's like the fact that sex trafficking is a multi-billion industry, pornography, multi-billion-dollar industry, pedophilia is breaking out, all the stuff we see happening. It's like, I think just collectively, we have to all just take a step back and say, okay, something sinister is afoot here.
That's right. That's right.
And I'm glad you asked that question, because where did it start? It started with that book, then the publication of Playboy magazine, and then the explosion of the whole pornographic industry, and then its adoption into the mainstream. So like I said earlier, we live in a pornographic culture.
Yeah.
A culture in which pornography is the wallpaper of our lives, in which it casts men as sexual predators, casts women as sexual objects, casts sex as a meaningless recreational act. That is deeply problematic. And so, so our film, Raised on Porn, tries to, confront the public health crisis that is porn. We have another docu-series coming out in a few months called Beyond Fantasy, which addresses the porn industry and how it's being created, and it addresses it on that front. You guys, I know, are doing a lot of messaging on this. So I just think it's something that we've got to work hard at messaging around and really shifting the locus of thought in the mass consciousness of society regarding the issue of pornography and human sexuality.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I'll just finish off with one more thought here, and I've got another couple of questions that I'd love to ask. Is when people try to diminish, say, the significance of sex and the sexual act or sexual activity, I find it just is so incongruent, because all I see in schools and in communities is that when we get sex wrong, it causes so much harm and heartache. And that, for me alone, is proof that there's something unique about this activity, unlike other things that humans do between one another, is the disproportionate harm and trauma that is honestly a cultural phenomenon now as a result of when we don't value this activity, irrespective of, like we've said, what worldview, perspectives, and personal experience we bring to the table. We just see time and time again, when we get this wrong, the harms to ourselves and others.
You brought up the point that human sexuality is potentially life-creating. It is also potentially a source of getting a disease. It is also a source of creating irreparable lifelong damage to a person. Like, there is something potent. I had a lot of these discussions with college students on campuses when we were doing screenings of Liberated, because it deals with this whole subject. And you just can't get around as much as, and it's not like, I'm not out trying to police people's sex lives, but it is something to say that each one of us should take time to process how we think about this, how this might affect our life, how it's, where else in life do we say, if it feels good, do it? I mean, like, where else in life is that going to yield good results for you?
That's right.
So life is a balance of tempering our appetites to to apply wisdom to our lives, to ensure our own well-being, the well-being of those around us. And yeah, sometimes that means sacrificing. Sometimes that means self-discipline. Sometimes that means putting somebody else ahead of ourselves. Like,
Absolutely.
and I think all those things get lost in the hookup culture where it's just like, swipe right, let's swipe left generation, and it's just leaving human carnage in the
Absolutely.
way. And
Absolutely. I'm going to change the pace, and if it's not heavy already, for those listening along, but we're going to continue to unpack a couple of things based on Benji's experience out in the field creating documentaries on these topics. And Benji, you've met men who have trafficked, pimped, and purchased other humans and exploited them. Can I ask, what was that experience like? What did you feel? What did you learn about men and humans through that experience?
Yeah, I mean, we've spent a lot of time exploring the dark side of humanity with the films that we create. And when you see Beyond Fantasy, I think it's the most hard-hitting documentary that we've ever made. I think it's also telling that the darkest, most sinister, sociopathic people that I personally have met are not human traffickers in the traditional sense, which I've met those guys, but pornographers. And there's a depth of darkness there that we encountered. I'm thinking of this one producer as an example, who, when I met with these pornographers, I really wanted them to be themselves on camera. I wanted to explore the inner workings of their psychology and how they thought about all of this. And so I tried to conduct the interviews in a way where they would recreate those moments of producing these films. And with this one producer, it was clear that there was this moment in the interview when his eyes kind of switched and he was there and you could see it and he was coming alive. And I asked him, what do you want to see on set happen? And can you describe that? Can you walk me through that? So he's there and he's articulating this, and he says, this is an exact quote. He said, when she's there and she's shivering and she's shaking because she's so overwhelmed by what's happening, he goes, I just lay it on harder and I lay it on harder and I lay it on harder until they snap, until they're a heap on the floor. And he said, that's one of the most beautiful things in the world. And so what he's trying to accomplish is finding new girls who don't fully understand what they're getting themselves into. And then he wants to overwhelm them in the context of a porn scene that is capturing the robbing of their innocence and the fracturing of their humanity on camera, to feed that as the heady wine to porn consumers who are so numbed and jaded by everything that they've already seen. So he's serving up the heroin of pornography. And what it requires is the enacting of a person's humanity in order to destroy it in the presence of a video camera. And he actually has them speak into the camera and say, hi, mommy, hi, daddy, what do you think of your little daughter now? And so it's a level of evil that's difficult to wrap your mind around. But for me, coming in proximity to that, it's, and just in general, in proximity to the larger behemoth system of the commercial, global predatory commercial sex industry, there's a vicarious kind of trauma and a secondary PTSD that happens. And so I would leave these seasons of filming and I not knowing what was happening with me, like walking around feeling like I could just break down crying at any moment and not even knowing why. And it was at that point that I myself had to start getting therapy just by being in proximity to these people. You can't even imagine the fracturing of the lives that happens to these poor young women. And so yeah, just to say that, I mean, I've often thought I don't want to share this planet with people like that. And it's staring into the eye of the beast. It's recognizing the humanity's capacity for extreme evil, and to stop pretending like this is some fun, harmless, erotic experience, and to recognize the utter evil that is at the heart of this, to stare that in the face, to call it what it is, to expose it, and hopefully to eradicate it.
Yes. So confronting to hear that again, Benji, and it's nothing that I haven't read or listened to or known, but there's just something about saying that out loud and letting the reality of that just confront you again and again. And I was reading Robert Jensen this week and reading his Getting Off, and he talks about this. He talks about these porn producers where this is actually what they're trying to elicit. It's complete violence against women, and it's completely about exploiting and destroying them. It's so far removed from anything to do with true sex and true intimacy, and it's horrific, and this needs to be heard. It needs to be said. And something that I have brought into these conversations is not about guilting people, but the reality is, and I had to confront this reality in my own life, is that, like, if you've watched pornography, if you've spent time viewing this, irrespective of what you've clicked on, you have become a patron of this. You have become a patron of an industry where money is spent and fueling these kinds of men and this kind of evil, and it's destroying the lives of those involved and those watching it. And something that we are exploring, and something we hear all the time, is then the secondary and tertiary impacts of that, where marriages and relationships and families are destroyed because of men who consume this material. And there's something so desperately sick that people would be aroused by this. And again, it's that looking to get that hit because they've become so desensitized. They've lost their humanity, as Robert Jensen would say, and to reclaim it.
Yeah, you see it in the lives of these girls, that they are the repositories for all of the offloaded existential pain, alienation, rage, and hatred towards women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that men have, and evacuate into this person who has no choice but to receive it. And the implication of that is the fracturing of their humanity. It's the extinguishing of that soul inside of them. So one porn performer said to me, a male performer, that I asked him about who were the people that he liked to work with. And he pointed out this girl, and he said, oh, I like this girl over here because the light hasn't gone out in her eyes yet. And then I said, elaborate on what you mean by that. He said, well, usually after about 3 to 6 months, he said, in this industry, the light will go out in their eyes. And he said, and that's not interesting anymore. And so I think that was very telling to me of, like, okay, if this industry is such a harmless, fun, erotic, it's been about being sex positive, then why is it extinguishing the life and the performers who go in and are part of it? And so we did another docuseries called Entering Pornland that will come out this fall. And that one is specifically looking at the individual lives of pornography performers and their journey into porn and how it impacted them. And so there's just so much that people need to understand and learn about all of this. And from our perspective, we felt like we don't want to just talk about this. Like, we have a critical analysis of the whole larger global commercial sex industry, pornography, all of that, but people need to hear from the horse's mouth as well. And so all these documentaries that we do, Beyond Fantasy, Entering Pornland, that I mentioned, it's entirely composed of people in the industry, performers and producers, because once you see past the cover narrative, I think you have to wrestle with the reality of what's actually going on. There was one girl that I interviewed, and her story was so horrific. I mean, when I interviewed her, she was only 19 years old, and she had just entered the porn industry at 18. And at one point in her story, I mean, she said she wanted to get into porn because she saw a special with Jenna Jameson on E when she was 13. She thought, this is what I want to do with my life, you know, to be, she wanted to feel glamorous and she wanted to feel beautiful. She didn't understand the predatory nature of the porn industry and what it would require of her. And so her story was in conflict. And at one point, I was just so upset by everything that she was sharing with me that I just asked her this question. It kind of, in a way, just kind of like blurted out of me. And I said, you know, what do you really want in life? And with tears streaming down her face, she said, I just want to be loved. And she said, no one has ever even bought me flowers. And so I think for us, like, that was just such a moment of realization about who these girls are. Yes, you may see them on a Twitter page posing with the come hither look. You may see them playing the role, but behind that veneer is a real human with a real story, with real human desires. She ended up in a hospital 2 days later because of complications from all the sex she was having in the porn industry. And she called us, and I'm like, we to her felt like the closest thing to something safe that she could call. So we go there, and to pick her up from the hospital, we were able to be the first ones to bring her flowers in her life. But it was just, you go into this industry and you realize that it's an industry of dehumanization. And really what people want is they want to be treated with dignity. They want to be treated, they want, like, they would try to play this role with us, but inevitably always cross these thresholds of personal realization when we weren't treating them like an object, when we were treating them like, you're a real person, you know. And everything's lying to us. Everything's lying to us. The porn industry's lying to us. Social media is lying to us. Our politicians, everything's lying from this young age. And it really causes people to divorce themselves from their humanity. And so when we get on the same level of these people and you really actually get to see who they are, and you get to see that humanity come back up inside of them, I mean, and the light come back into their eyes, and a realization that I was created for love. I mean, that is the most beautiful thing in the world. And so I just think for everyone out there, like, you got to make up your mind about what this industry is, what it's creating, and the impact that it's having on our world. And it's time to say goodbye to pornography. Seriously, like, it's just time. It's time.
It is time. It's long past due. It's so far past due. And I thank you for saying that, Benji. I thank you for just all you've done to sacrifice and do to expose these stories, and obviously to these brave women and these people who have met with you to share their stories and expose the realities of the industry. But I thank you for, you know, it's taken a personal cost, just like it's done for, I know, the team members here at Collective Shout. Those women have sacrificed and put their own well-being ahead of trying to do something about this. And the same for yourself, the same for Robert Jensen and all the incredible people that have gone before us to shift and push back on porn and porn culture. And I just want to thank you so much for your time. I do want to just mention a couple of things, and I hope it's okay that I do this, but I know that you guys would never brag about yourselves and what you do. And Benji just doesn't do this just to tell stories, but actually to, you know, him and his team to actually transform lives. And they have helped women exit the sex industry, exit the porn industry, and funding their, and this just makes me emotional to say it, you know, like, you guys have raised funds to help them get therapy and get care and find safe places to be in this world. And I just thank you for that. And it's an incredible thing that you guys have done, and it challenges me.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, there's nothing more important, you know, than seeing a life changed, and the fact that we get to play a part of that I mean, that's what life's about. Life is not, everything that we see out there today is vain and empty. What real life is about, what real deep abiding joy comes from, is about serving other people and helping other people and laying our lives down for others. And from that place of love, like that's the most rich life that you can ever have. And it's beautiful. And so, yeah, thank you guys for all that you're doing as well. Like I said, we've learned so much from you, and we're just grateful for your partnership.
Thank you so much, Benji. I knew I'd get emotional listening to you, but yeah, I thank you so much for all that you've done. And like I said, I probably wouldn't be here or wouldn't have arrived at this position and had the privileges to work with Collective Shout and yourselves if I hadn't obviously met you and seen your documentaries and seen your work, which has obviously shifted something in my heart, and still on that journey of resisting porn culture and wanting something better, not only for myself, but my relationships in the world. And I just want to thank you, and looking forward to continuing to work together, hopefully catching up in LA one day and continuing this work. And for everyone who's joined us, we know that this would have been a confronting conversation. It's obviously, it still confronts me sitting in this space. We will provide resources and provide links to obviously Benji's films and what's coming up and what's available for you guys to share with your friends, share with your family, and obviously do all that you can with what you have to expose this, to educate others, and do something to help the people exploited in these industries. So we thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to engaging with you soon. Thank you.